A lot of getting good at mixing comes down to developing your ear and practice, but there are some very specific things that you can do that pros do and amateurs tend not to know about. So today I want to talk about simple things that can help you make better mixes right away. The first mixing hack is to, every now and again when you're mixing a song, change the volume that you're listening at. For one thing, you just want to protect your hearing, but that's not the main focus of this, although please, for the love of all that is good and holy, protect your hearing. The main mixing reason for this is that often things will jump out at you with regards to the balance of the mix when you listen to it quietly. When you're listening to a mix quietly, you might notice that a certain element sticks out way too much, or a certain element kind of gets lost in the mix. Alternatively, listening to a mix really loud will instantly alert you to anything that is painful. This is especially a problem with upper mid frequencies. So if you've got, say, a lead, synth, or vocal that is just hitting these harsh frequencies, listening really loud will make that immediately apparent and you'll be able to go deal with it. To build on to listening to music with a different reference point, actually use reference tracks. So take a mix that you really like and a song that's really well mixed in your opinion, and that's in a similar vein to the song that you're working on, and play them side by side and bounce back and forth. Do not compare yourself to the pro mix, but do use it as a bit of a reality check. So how are the levels of things balanced out? What's the frequency spectrum? Does your mix have like way too much low end compared to the professional one, or way too much high end? Or is something out of whack with your mix that you could fix now that your ears have been kind of woken up to reality by the reference track? Reference tracks are often the most instantaneous way to get feedback on your mix without even having to show it to another person, because it'll tell you whether or not you're in the right ballpark or not. Moving on to some more specific tips. Use a de-esser on your vocals. If you're a bit newer to production, a de-esser is a plugin that listens for really harsh S sounds called sibilants in a vocal or in a voice. It finds those and then clamps down on them so they don't cut through as harshly. And I can always tell if someone did or did not use a de-esser. And typically, amateur mixes don't bother with a de-esser or don't know that it's a good idea to use one, and a lot of pro mixes do use a de-esser. I can immediately tell the difference, and using a de-esser on your vocals can pretty much immediately elevate your vocal mix to another level. In addition, listen for how much reverb and delay people use. And using delay on your vocals is actually a tip in and of itself, because the temptation is to just flood your vocals in reverb and leave it at that, but if you want them to kind of have a space to them and have a nice sheen on them without flooding them, using a slapback delay or a slight ping pong delay can have much the same effect and can really make them sound more polished without really clogging up your frequency spectrum. Another thing that can keep you from clogging up your frequency spectrum with reverbs and delays is to cut their lows. A lot of reverb plugins these days have this built in. You can go in and cut the low end of your reverb, and I do highly recommend doing this. Most reverb plugins give you way more low end than you're gonna need, and they typically clog up the low end of your mix and clash with other elements. So cut that and allow your vocal to really float on top. And really, there are probably a lot of things that could benefit from getting more of their low end cut. For instance, I heard the tip from the deadmau5 Masterclass, which I did a full review of, I'll link that at the end, where he said he likes to put a low cut filter on his master at around 30 Hertz, because those speakers can't even reproduce this, and so you'll never hear it, and it can take up precious headroom when you're trying to do mastering. So it's good to just cut that because it's not really helping anyone and could be hurting you. In addition, there are a lot of elements that could benefit from having their lows cut, including, once again, vocals, lead synths, I mentioned reverbs earlier, and sometimes even basses, especially if you have a separate bass and sub. Once again, use your ears when doing this and do it to taste and do it in conjunction with a reference track to kind of keep your ears anchored in reality. But oftentimes, a lot of elements and a lot of synth presets and a lot of samples come with way more low end than you'll need. Up next, this one is absolutely aimed at beginners. If you're not using sidechain compression and or ducking, you're really missing out. And I'm about to blow your mind here. So essentially what ducking is it's getting an element out of the way of another element. So the classic example is that pumping effect you hear on bass tracks in EDM tunes. So the kick hits and the bass is quiet, and then the bass slowly comes in, so you get that pumping effect. That's ducking, and you'll hear it across pretty much every genre of electronic music, and for good reason. A lot of electronic music kick drums are super low-end heavy, and of course a lot of electronic music basses are super low-end heavy. So this is a way to keep them from fighting with each other. It lets the kick punch through really hard, and it lets the bass punch through, but stay out of the way of the kick. So if you want to do this really easily and you're working with 4 on the floor stuff, or you don't mind doing a bit of MIDI routing, check out LFO Tool or Kickstart are both good plugins for that. And then if you want to do it the slightly old-fashioned way, look into setting up sidechain compression, which basically it's a compressor that compresses the bass, but it looks at the kick for cues on what to do. So when the kick hits, the compressor clamps down on the bass. And how extreme the ducking is and how long it holds down on the bass will depend on the genre and depend on your taste. For like dubstep and stuff, it's a little bit less. For drum and bass, it's even shorter, but it's still present. It just allows the kick, and sometimes the snare too, if you have a really heavy snare, to punch through and remain clear even through a bunch of other elements. Up next, let's talk about getting your sounds nice and wide. And there are a couple ways to do this. First of all, you can use like a chorus effect or a stereo widener. I would approach these with caution and always check your mix in mono, because sometimes those can do weird stuff to your phasing. A lot of synth patches also are decently stereo in and of themselves, or you could double an element. So say, for instance, you have a big super saw chord patch. What you could do, for one thing, is just crank the unison until it sounds nice and wide. That's a perfectly valid technique. Or one thing you could also do is have 2 synth patches that have slightly different settings. They sound kind of similar, but they are not the same, pan 1 left and pan 1 right. You can also do this with a couple of hi-hats. Maybe if you're doing a trap beat, you have hi-hats rattle around in different ears. Stuff like this can really bring a track to life and really fill up your stereo spectrum. Difference in what's in your right ear and what's in your left ear is what makes a track sound wide. So try to take advantage of that. And if you're recording stuff with real instruments like rock or metal, it's good to actually record, say, a guitar part twice and then pan 1 left and 1 right. Even if you have a really good guitarist, they'll play those elements ever so slightly differently. And because of that, those little differences will register as stereo width once panned left and right. Up next, let's talk about distortion. It's been a bit of a trend in the electronic music and electronic pop scene a bit to make very abrasive and distorted electronic music, kind of like a bass boosted meme if it was actually good. And I've really been enjoying that kind of music. I think it's pretty dope. So if you want to add some interest, you'd be surprised at just how far you can push a distortion and still have it sound good. But the distortion effect does not have to be extreme. One place where I find distortion is incredibly useful is on bass sounds, because you want your bass to register not only on good sound systems where they reproduce a lot of low end, but on kind of crappy sound systems where they are very mids heavy. So having a bit of distortion on your bass will allow you to still hear it, same for an 808, it'll allow it to be more present in the listener's ear regardless of the sound system they're listening on. A good example of this being used is Marshmello's 808s. They're not even 808s and they're not even really sub basses. They're just these kind of gritty 808-like basses. And say what you want about Marshmello, but that's a very smart technique to use, especially for someone who's trying to gain a wide audience. And finally, the thing that will probably make the biggest difference out of everything, and I saved this for last because it is a little bit of a beginner thing, but it's very important. Make sure you're layering the right things. Of course, I put air quotes on that because there's technically no one right way to layer electronic music and to choose electronic music elements. However, knowing what the kind of fundamental building blocks of a song are will really go a long way in ending up with a clear mix. So think about rock or metal. In rock or metal, you've got a few fundamental elements. You've got the drum kit, you've got the bass guitar and the electric guitar, and then maybe a vocalist. And with just those elements, those are like the minimum viable rock elements right there. And if you combine just those things, boom, you've got a full rock mix. And that's enough to sound satisfying in full just with those elements. In electronic music, there's a very similar kind of super basic layout. You've got your main drums, especially kicks and snares, and then hi-hats kind of floating over the top of them. You've got your sub bass, which is often separated from your kind of grittier bass, and that's the one that really cuts through. It doesn't have to be super gritty, but you've got your sub bass, your main bass, and then you've got some kind of chord element. This is typically a little wider, so some kind of plucks or pads or super saws, something like that, maybe a piano. And then you've got your lead floating over the top of everything. So that could be a pluck lead, that could be kind of a harsher lead, and then of course a vocal over the top of that, in which case the lead would kind of get pushed back into the mix a bit, or not be there at all. Those are the fundamental building blocks of any EDM, other electronic music, or hip hop beat. And sometimes you can remove elements of those, but typically that's how one of these songs is constructed. So what I would recommend you do is listen to music that you like and actually write down the elements that you hear and how they're used and the function they serve. Once you've done this a few times, you'll have a much better feel for what to layer and like how loud it should be, how bassy or trebly it should be, all that kind of stuff you'll start to gain a more intuitive feel for if you study music that you like. And once you understand how a normal song is constructed, then you can start to break those rules in a way that still sounds good. I've made a lot of other videos about mixing on this channel, so if you'd like to see a video about my absolute favorite plugins for making and mixing electronic music, you can click or tap up over here. And if you'd like to see a video about how I took a weak EDM drop and turned it into a really powerful EDM drop, click or tap down over here. I think you'll find that really helpful. If you have a mixing trick that really leveled up your game, be sure to leave it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.